Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Anthea Butler, president of the American Society for Church History, and I'm here in Philadelphia with John Ebel, who is the incoming president for the Society of Church History. We want to welcome you to this panel for David Hall's award-winning book. And before we get started, we want to thank you, first of all, for joining us for this webinar. We appreciate your participation. We realize that many of you could not come to the annual meeting this past January, but we want to make a pitch to you. We want to make a pitch to you that is from the bottom of our heart, first of all, and then secondarily, from the bottom of our kind of empty pocketbook. This meeting was a very difficult meeting for lots of different reasons. Omicron came in and messed us up. And for 2 years, we've been trying to navigate this. But one of the things that happened as a result of the New Orleans meeting, where many of you were either unable to come or had to not come at the last minute because you unfortunately caught COVID-19, was that we had to pay the hotel whatever it was that we did not fill up, which came out to be a significant amount of money to the tune of over $25,000. And so what we are asking of you today, and John is going to give a little bit of a pitch too, because he's been better than this than I am, is that you would go to our webpage, churchhistory.org. There is a donate here button, and we're asking you to very kindly think about donating to the American Society for Church History. You love coming to our meetings. Most of you tell me all of the time that you love our meeting because you get to talk to people. It's a place where you can network and connect with someone else. But if we don't get to have these meetings because we continue to incur these significant costs from meetings that we have to, break apart because of this pandemic, then that means that we cannot offer to you the same kind of meetings that we've had in the past. So I just want to ask you today, as the president of the society, to please consider donating as generously as you can to the society to help us make up for this shortfall that's happened in the past year. We are intending to have a wonderful meeting here in Philadelphia. John is here with me today because we're going out to scout sites and to do a little sightseeing and think about the kinds of things that you would want to see next January when you come to the meeting. We're already crossing our fingers that it won't be snowy, but if it is, it'll be beautiful anyway. We want you to eat some good cheesesteaks and enjoy some pretzels and things like that. But there's a ton of history here in Philadelphia that will be worthy of our meeting. And we hope that you'll be able to join us. But for us to have a really great meeting, we need to make sure that we have some donations. So I want to just encourage you to be able to donate to us. Again, that donate button is on the front of the churchhistory.org webpage. And now I'm going to turn it over unless John has anything else he wants to add in here.
Just there are a couple of other ways that you can help us out. One is when it comes time to renew your membership, to do so at a benefactor level in a sort of sustaining membership role, which is one of the options that you have when you renew your membership. And another is to evangelize on behalf of the American Society of Church History and to let your colleagues and students know what a meaningful organization this is and how it has enriched your professional lives and your personal lives, and to get them involved so that we expand our membership base. Some of the financial issues that we're dealing with are indeed related directly to COVID, and others have to do with other sort of shifts that many medium and smaller sized professional societies are facing right now. So I think we need to think more broadly about reorienting ourselves and our philanthropic giving to benefit ASCH.
Yeah. I could have said it better myself. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to toss it over to Charles Hambrick-Stowe, who's going to introduce the panel and get us started today. Thank you, Charles.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Anthea. So to begin this discussion of David Hall's magisterial work, The Puritans, a Transatlantic History. First, we need to thank Adrian Weimer for organizing this roundtable. So thank you, Adrian. Been a long time coming, but here we are. Dr. Hall received the Philip Schaff Prize for the Puritans at our society's 2020 virtual meeting. And David is actually the two-time Schaff Prize winner with Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment 30 years ago. That's hard to believe, but that's a unique achievement. We'd hoped for an extended get-together in New Orleans, but now this is a time for us to honor David for his significance in our field of study and to thank him for his wise and gracious mentorship to many of us. The Puritans is a great book, the culmination of a great career. over the course of more than 50 years, David has expanded our understanding of early modern history with groundbreaking studies of Puritanism as a way of life fueled by spiritual vigor, two phrases from 1968. The New England ministry, antinomian and other dissent, witchcraft, print culture and the history of the book, popular and lived religion experienced at ground level, the radical social vision and political achievement of Puritan New England, and the Reformed theological tradition of which Puritanism was an expression, all with a transatlantic perspective that comes into sharp focus in the book that we are here to consider. And our three panelists reflect this transatlantic perspective. Mark Valeri is Neve's Distinguished Professor at the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and Professor of History at Washington University in St. Louis. Also a Schaff Prize winner. He's recently published Politics and Economics in the Oxford Handbook of Jonathan Edwards and the First Calvinist Encounters in the New World in the Oxford Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism. Margo Todd is Annenberg Professor of History Emerita at the University of Pennsylvania, with several books and many articles on the social, political, legal impact of Protestantism in Scotland. Her chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Puritanism is on the problem of Scotland's Puritans. Paul C.H. Lim, Associate Professor of the History of Christianity at Vanderbilt, co-edited that Cambridge Companion with his chapter, Puritans and the Church of England, Historiography and Ecclesiology. The author of several books on English Puritanism, he's currently working on Christology and modernity in Enlightenment England. So with that, Mark, and then Margo and Paul.
Thank you very much. Charlie just waved. The sound's coming through all right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, great. Okay, just wanted to check on that. David, it was a pleasure to read this book, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Anthea. Thank you, Charlie, for kicking this off. I want to begin by saying that several methodological issues shadow David's book, especially for me, the relationship among theological history, the history of lived religion, and religion and politics. His work stands out from other recent formulations of the issues. We can take, for example, Michael Winship's Hot Protestants, recently published. Winship provides an overarching narrative of Puritan attempts to exercise political authority, culminating in their regime in New England. Unsympathetic to Puritan theology, which he describes as severe and melancholic, Winship stresses the Puritan exercise of power, as do historians of gender in early New England and of Anglo-Indigenous encounters. Abram Van Ingen's Sympathetic Puritans probes Puritan moral discourse and its relationship to social community. In the city-state of Boston, Mark Peterson writes about much more than Puritans, but nevertheless dwells on their civic project, the social contradictions of their notions of a godly city-state. Rather than approach Puritanism merely as an antecedent to or accomplice of some social and political force, the religion and something else formulation, David plunges into a deep study of Puritanism as a religious movement, full stop, and only then about some of the civic dimensions of godly devotion. He writes plenty about social life in the process, but gives the leading role to religious thought and life. His Puritans accordingly do not fit our preconceptions. They cared for theology more than they did for politics, held proper worship above property rights to be the goal of human community, and were fixated on eternal salvation rather than imperial expansion. David suggests that we have lost track of this version of Puritanism. It was not, he explains, that Puritans detached their piety from political or social issues. Hall devotes much of his narrative to political matters, especially in England and Scotland. He previously has written about Puritanism and public life in New England in A Reforming People. He maintains in the Puritans, however, that we ought to understand their theology rightly before we begin to issue pronouncements on the political and social implications of their religious vision. In his recounting of Puritan discourse, to put it a bit differently, David describes Puritanism as a coherent, even if complex movement from the days of Elizabeth to the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Citing Puritan references to continental divines such as Martin Bucer, Rick Bullinger, and Theodore Beza, David contends that theology provides the line of continuity among different generations of Puritans in England, Scotland, Ireland, and New England. He depends on a large literature of Reformed theology by scholars who, often writing from a confessional perspective, are well-versed in the history of the internal debates among early modern Calvinists. Specialists such as Richard Muller and Paul Lim, for example, correct common misperceptions that there was a Calvinist consensus on predestination, say, or that the doctrine served as an unnegotiable core of the tradition. David's genius, however, is to place such technical debates in the background and focus on the theological ideas that shaped common life and social experience among the Puritans. He does so by drawing on late 16th and 17th century texts that conveyed theological conviction in non-technical fashion: sermons, diaries, polemical pamphlets, creeds, ecclesiastical manifestos, and governmental pronouncements. He concentrates his commentary on sermons and manuals for piety that formed what he calls, drawing from the Puritan lexicon, practical divinity. We might otherwise think of this genre of spiritual or devotional writing as something like a theology or a divinity. That's why he reaches for the term practical divinity. It's not mere spiritual writing. It incorporates theological tradition. As David describes it, however, practical divinity encompassed, accounted for, and accommodated tensions within Reformed theological ideas. The word doctrine here is a bit too formal and linear. We can take, for example, Puritan ideas of divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Were preachers and household leaders to stress the election of saints and the power of providence over fallen souls, or the divinely granted vocation given to all people to strive and to submit to disciplines of humiliation and repentance? David contends that there was no logically definitive answer. Here he goes beyond Charlie's insightful book on Puritan devotional literature, The Practice of Piety, by demonstrating the ambiguity in practical divinity about providence and human liberty, grace and law. Hall focuses on English divines from the Elizabethan era, such as Edward Daring, George Gifford, Richard Greenham, and Henry Smith, on early Stuart divines in England, such as William Perkins and Richard Rogers, and on early Stuart divines in Scotland, such as John Craig and Robert Rollock. These writers attempted to parse Christian experience in terms that accorded with Reformed teaching on providence and predestination, which reinforced the doctrines of divine sovereignty, human incapacity or sinfulness and grace, and on human liberty and divine law, which mandated repentance and reform. As Hall describes practical divinity in such terms, he challenges a long-established literature on Puritan theology at crucial points. Perry Miller claimed that by the late 17th century, New England's Puritans had compromised their Augustinian heritage with a covenant or federal theology that resolved the grace law tension overly much in favor of moral and political responsibility, resulting, as Miller claimed, in theological demise and bourgeois social morality. Norman Pettit relied on the notion of preparation to explain Puritan approaches to this tension. People prepared themselves for grace through the performance of pious duties and acts of moral striving. Hall sets these old paradigms aside. By his account, Miller's lament that federal theology was a betrayal does not fit the picture. nor does Pettit's idea of a clear logical sequence, legal works as a preparation for the divine work of conversion. David argues instead that practical divines attempted to show how tensions between grace and law could be accepted as a paradox that in itself was a meaningful theological affirmation. Such tensions, as Puritan hoped, produced lifelong patterns of devotion, deep distress redeemed by periods of spiritual joy, awareness of human culpability, yet compassion for suffering, admission that children were not necessarily converted while raising them within the church, introspective melancholy ameliorated by corporate worship, scrutiny and humiliation, yet assurance of salvation. Within this framework, conversion was perceived as a lifelong process rather than an identifiable moment. Practical divinity also functioned as an impetus for Puritans to promote the campaigns for moral and political reform for which they became so famous or infamous: poor relief education, reform of legal codes, especially in New England, the elimination of non-residency among the clergy, reduction of Sabbath day violations, and a campaign against the oppressions or corruptions of an increasingly absolutist monarchy in England and Scotland. By showing how these social and political agendas flowed from practical divinity and practical divinity from Reformed theology, Hall helps to explain the leading role of theology, as complex and ambiguous as it was, in lived experience and political life. So he does not here abandon his previous insistence in Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment on popular or lived religion, a framework that highlights family loyalties, communal dynamics, and folkways. He folds lived religion into his analysis of Puritan theology. Practical divinity was the discourse, if you will, that bridged theological utterance and lived religion. David's narrative accordingly conveys interpretations that offer alternatives to contemporary readings of Puritanism, especially in America. For one, the story of New England's Puritan order is, by David's account, merely the last chapter of, nearly an appendage to, a deep history of Reformed thought and practice that originated in Calvin's Geneva. The themes of Reformed theology that he carefully delineates, their affirmations and complexities, surface again and again: the 1570s, the 1590s, the 1620s, the 1640s, as tensions that preoccupied Puritan communities in England, Scotland, and New England. That being the case, he intimates, it is misleading to frame our reading of Puritanism within the political or social agendas of any one period or place. Americanist readings of the Puritans as progenitors of a Jeffersonian quest for liberty of religious conscience, of democratic republicanism, of an imperial design to wrest North America out of the control of Native Americans, or of a capitalist drive to prosperity, are each, in David's view, misleading or at least incomplete in such terms. Puritanism was, and here, quote, a culture centered on certain religious practices rather than a political or social program. David also provides a portrait that confounds the notion, Winship's notion perhaps, that Puritans were bound to a theology in which logical precision and hypermoralism overrode the complexities of lived religion. David maintains throughout that Puritan practical divinity accommodated ambiguity and tension. It is something of a mistake, he suggests, to attempt to nail down a Puritan intellectual world without contradictions and contingencies, or Puritan politics for that matter. Within the bounds of Reformed thought, Puritanism varied from one locale to another, one national circumstance to another. In England, it faced a hostile monarchy and eventually settled for a dissenting status. In Scotland, it achieved enough recognition in its Presbyterian form to command a powerful social presence. In New England, its leaders rejected separatism because they, in part, were the established order. In David's account, that is, the separatist strain within Puritanism, including antipathy toward the Church of England and the monarchy, or to public and civic order in themselves, represented temporary or minority sentiments rather than the more enduring reformed character of their culture. One lesson that we can learn from David, perhaps, is the value of returning to what we might have thought to have been overly familiar subjects and rethink them. Despite what appears on the surface to be an agenda for early American historians to refrain from further contemplations of the Anglo-Protestant founders of New England and to focus our efforts instead on the vast early America of racial, religious, and national diversity, the Puritans still command intense interest. It would be foolish to suppose that we are done with them, that we have them covered, so to speak, and have no more room in our conversation for the likes of Thomas Cartwright, William Perkins, or John Cotton. David's hands, that conversation does not sound like a Perry Miller-esque account of theological ideas, their logic, and their nearly inevitable clash with social reality. Nor does it sound like a quick dismissal of theological abstraction in the interest of uncovering the social and political power of religious teaching. Rather, David's The Puritans give us reasons to reconsider a careful and informed reading of theological preoccupations, all placed within the story of early modern Britain on both sides of the Atlantic, with all of its contingencies and perplexities. To be sure, Puritan voices might sound strange to our ears today. That is all the more reason to attend to them carefully. Thanks. Thank you, David, for the book.
Go. Margo, are you ready?
Yes, okay. Well, I want to thank David as well for an extraordinary new contribution to scholarship on Puritans. I admire it for way too many reasons to count, but I'd like just to mention a few of its major contributions, and then I hope open up a conversation about the final chapter, the epilogue, which is about legacies, about the legacy of Puritans. So first, the study is genuinely British in scope rather than just English, as so many earlier treatments of Puritans have been. And Britain is set within the larger European as well as Atlantic landscape, with particular emphasis on Geneva, as there must be, Strasbourg, Frankfurt, the Low Countries, never mind the North American colonies. Puritans really did comprise an international movement, and that's visible throughout the book, and I appreciate that. David also sets Puritans within the larger intellectual landscape of the 16th century, with frequent and helpful reminders of its Erasmian humanist foundations, which again, I particularly appreciate. And I would certainly be remiss if I didn't mention the monumental endnotes, 133 pages of very substantive material. It's truly an admirable collection of the most recent research, classic studies, and well-chosen primary sources. True confession, I covet my neighbor's footnotes. David brings the historiography of Puritans right up to the present with some important interventions. A couple of examples. He declines simplistic definitions, instead encompassing the tensions within Puritans' theology and practice, the use of terror in much Puritan preaching, for instance, deliberately to instill anxiety, over against the Sibbes, Culverwell, Preston emphasis on the universal offer of salvation, though only for the elect, of course. One might include Samuel Ward of Sidney, Sussex in the latter group. He gives us a spectrum of belief within Puritans, from moderates all the way to radicals, and he draws both the striking departures of Scottish from English Puritans and the common ground that enables us to speak of both as Puritans. So I have a question and a comment for him, both drawn from that epilogue about legacies. I teach 2 courses in which Puritans have a very strong presence, 16th and 17th century British Isles. Students read many of the primary sources David cites, and they pore over Perkins' chart of salvation and damnation. In our final discussion, I always ask them whether early modern Puritans matter, the central question of David's epilogue. And lately, I've begun taking notes on their answers. In a recent term, I got 3 that stood out. One student repeated a statement that I've made about Puritans being intrinsically interesting as people with the courage of their convictions, whether in making daring demands of authorities for further reform of the church or taking up arms against the forces of their own king in the name of true religion, along with the traditional civil liberties, of course, violated by Charles I. My student protested. Interesting, yes, he said, but not admirable or heroic. He pointed out that marauding crusaders wreaking havoc across Anatolia also had the courage of their convictions, as do modern jihadists. And he concluded, and I'm quoting him here, studying Puritans is a good reminder that religion has a lot to answer for, and we should beware zealots. Perhaps not surprisingly, the student was quite self-consciously of Irish descent. He had a point. A second student thought that Puritans were a useful case study of how, and I'm quoting her, hubris and Pharisaism can doom a reform movement. Hubris and Pharisaism, not terms one often hears undergraduates use. She hoped that the radical wing of the Democratic Party could avoid the sort of holier than thou vibe, again a quote, of people like Lucy Hutchinson, whom she'd read, who boasted that as a child she had declined to play with her little friends in favor of Bible reading and prayer. Or George Gifford's archetypal Puritan zealotes, denouncing assorted sins in a dialogue with his not fully reformed minister, Atheos, the defender of good neighborhood. Atheos, in that dialogue, who liked hanging about the pub, was the hands-down favorite of students who read this document, even the most serious of them. They insisted that Zelotes had lost the argument by his sheer obnoxiousness. It does make you wonder how many early modern readers might have drawn the same conclusion. One thinks of the Scottish minister who took ship for a Huguenot port in France, only to face a group of hostile fellow passengers insistent on putting him ashore or perhaps overboard, rather than have to listen to his incessant rebuking of their blasphemy and drunkenness. In fact, he never made it to France. He was put ashore and not far past Leith. David's book has offered much well-deserved criticism of distorting anti-Puritanism. And indeed, Nathaniel Hawthorne and his ilk have led readers far astray. But there is a certain element of truth in Bartholomew Fair's Puritan Zeal of the Land Busy. He was an entertaining character to contemporary audiences, particularly because the caricature had a basis in truth. Puritans did contribute during their own time to their bad reputation. Now, the third student was more positive, starry-eyed even. He said, and again I'm quoting, "There's actually something to that city on a hill thing." Puritans coming to Massachusetts, he said, sought to build a better society, a godly one, orderly and just, if not tolerant of anybody themselves. But for later Americans, and again quoting the student, they're not a bad reminder that hope is fundamental to the American experiment. I'd love to hear David's reactions to one or more of these students, and especially to student number 2. That's my question. You can take it as you will. My comment is more specific, perhaps picky, but it brings up a larger issue, and in the process may bring a little more credit to Puritans. David includes in his explanation for modern dismissal of Puritans, among other things, the bugbear of feminism, though I think he's really criticizing sexual license there. Now, all in the world that feminism means is the belief that men and women are of equal worth, equal humanity, and that they deserve equal rights under the law, equal opportunity. Puritans, of course, were by no stretch of the imagination feminists. But one of the few places in early modern Britain where we actually can find baby steps being taken in this direction is among them, particularly those of the Scottish persuasion. David mentions a new importance attached to women in family religion and education. But there's more to the story, and it comes out where we might least expect it, in the Kirk's discipline, in particular, the sexual discipline of men and women, and the Kirk's campaign to end the double standard, that is, the boys will be boys theory of sexual behavior. The first book of discipline and the rulings by general assemblies run by Puritan ministers required that discipline be executed, quote, without exception of persons, and that, quote, as well the man as the woman be held to high sexual standards. In 1567, the Scottish Parliament's Fornication Act commanded, again quoting, as well the man as the woman to underlie the penalties. The theory of gender equality before the law was thus clearly established in ecclesiastical and secular law at the behest of Puritans. Was it played out? The Kirk Session records of Perth, the town that I'm currently working on, suggest that it was. For the period 1577 to 1642, 49% of the persons cited before the court for fornication and adultery were men, 51% women. The double standard appears in this reformed town to have been well and truly quashed, though the numbers are not as impressive as Geneva's, where men bore the brunt of prosecutions. Both Scotland and Geneva are striking departures from English archidiaconal courts where such cases were tried, including those presided over by Puritans. The record of Scottish Puritans is far superior to that of their English counterparts. Scots permitted divorce for women and men right after the Reformation, 1560s, on the same grounds. When Puritans seized political power in England, however, their Adultery Act of 1650 was so far behind the egalitarian mark that they allowed men to divorce wives for the offense, but not women to divorce husbands. As David has told us, English and Scottish Puritans did take some diverging paths, though he's quite right that there's much more that united them. Again, Puritans in Scotland even were not feminists, but we might attach some credit to their efforts to ensure equal treatment before the law. They and Geneva set a standard that I think is still with us. So a Puritan legacy does hang on, and it's one among many, I think. So let's perhaps not blame the current state of affairs on feminism, but rather assign at least some blame to the behavior of Puritans themselves. They called themselves, with notable hubris, the godly, true professors of the authentic biblical faith. And they rebuked their neighbors with abandon, as student number 2 pointed out. That's not the sort of behavior well suited either to converting people in their own time or to establishing a positive legacy for the future. They sowed the seeds for their own destruction. Anyway, do with this what you will. I realize I'm being deliberately contentious here. But the fact remains that with a book like this one before us, we can all rejoice that light is still shining from that city on a hill in Massachusetts.
Thank you. Okay, Paul.
Thank you, Mark and Margo. Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to start my remarks by doing a hip hop and mid-brow intellectual discourse mashup. The hip hop song, which I'm pretty sure David Hall hasn't heard of, but perhaps either Anthea Butler or Brandon Bain, if he's in the audience, likely has, is called Precious Puritans by Propaganda, featuring Kevin K.O. Olusola. The intellectual discourse shows up in the Atlantic magazine in its March 10th, 2021 issue. The Atlantic article is by Shadi Hamid and is entitled America Without God. And Dr. Hamid is an Islamic political theorist and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. In this article by a Muslim academic, he makes an intriguing case that thinking about America without God seems nearly equivalent to thinking about 4th of July without fireworks. At the core of the founding narrative for America stood Christianity, according to Hamid, and that Christianity, for better and for worse, owed much to the Puritans, the group of Christians for whom the acronym WASP, W-A-S-P, is the most apt descriptive 4 letters. Hamid writes, though the United States wasn't founded as a Christian nation, Christianity was always intertwined with America's self-definition. Without it, Americans, conservatives and liberals alike, no longer have a common culture upon which to fall back on. So that's Dr. Hamid. Here's what Propaganda, the hip hop artist, has to say in his song, Precious Puritans. Takes a different turn. He goes, if you'd allow me a second to deal with some in-house issues here. Hey, Pastor, you know it's hard for me when you quote Puritans. Oh, the precious Puritans. Have you noticed our facial expressions, one of bewilderment and heartbreak, like, not you too, Pastor. You know there were chaplains on slave ships, right? Would you quote Columbus to Cherokees? Would you quote Cortez to Aztecs, even if their theology was good? It just sings of blind privilege, wouldn't you agree? Your precious Puritans. Oh, you get it, but you don't get it. Oh, that we can go back to an America that once were founded on Christian values, that don't build preachers like they used to. Oh, the richness of their revelation. It must be nice to not have to consider race. It must be nice to have time to contemplate the stars. Pastor, your colorless rhetoric is a cop-out. You see my skin, and I see yours, and they are beautiful, fearfully and wonderfully made, and divinely designed uniqueness. Shouldn't we celebrate that rather than act like it ain't there? I get it. Your Puritans got it, but. So why do I bring this lyrical intellectual mashup here as we celebrate the work of David Hall in his book, the award-winning book, something that I've learned a lot from and I've assigned to students, grad students here at Vanderbilt? I do so to highlight the fact that America still has a long and terrifying hangover from the legacy of the pre-founding fathers of this nation we call home. In other words, and put it bluntly, hate them or not, Puritans still matter. Every time someone curses at the hypocrisy and misalignment between the lofty ideals of the city on a hill and its ensuing legacy of quote unquote rapacious and invasive and exploitative appetite, by the way, these are words that I learned from my students as I assign some of these texts here in my university, as Margo shared hers as well from Penn. It is a long and arduous and painful shadowboxing match with the Puritans. David Hall has produced what might arguably be called his magnum opus. It is a product of massive erudition, plowing through a number of pamphlets, treatises, as well as unpublished arcane manuscripts. In other words, getting deeply into the granular strands of early modern Anglo-American religious political reform without losing the sight of the bigger picture. And I think that's the real genius of the book. Consequently, I would unhesitatingly say that this is one of those books that I can invite undergrads who are interested in learning more about this oft-caricatured group, as well as be a first port of call for other scholars who desire a sure-footed tour guide for this craggy terrain of early modern period of conquests and conversions, losses and lootings, cultural transformations, and political revolutions. For the remainder of my time, since it is such a rare treat to have Margo, Todd, Mark, Valeri, and David all together in one panel, I'd like to do something slightly unconventional. Rather than reading a draft of my review of Hall's book, I'm doing a review of his book for a journal. I'd like to raise some issues and questions that came up as I read it so as to get all of us in a conversation. The first question has to do with the intended and actual audience for this book. At a simple level, this was a book that most in the field knew was due to come from David. Even as many of us are deeply impressed with his 2012 book, A Reforming People, Puritanism and the Transformation of Public Life in New England, many of us are hoping for a synthetic account of the transatlantic dimensionality of this religious, political, and cultural force. And we got it with this one in 2019. I'd like to put to that question to the author himself directly today. Who was the intended audience, and what does that mean for us as we read the book today? The second issue has to do with how the Puritan movement, however it's defined, whether in England or New England, can render some interesting perspectives for today's struggles of various types. Hall identifies three aspects of the Puritan legacies in his epilogue. First has to do with its reformation of manners, and concomitant to that as a second term was its commitment to Reformed orthodoxy, and finally to historical memory, or how the past and present are connected. As any student of English Puritanism would readily recall, the English or British Civil War was coterminous with the Puritan Revolution. In that vein, their pursuit of reformation of manners is quite akin to what is happening in our woke culture today. By woke culture, I suggest nothing sardonic or sinister, but simply as a type of full court press to ensure that our behaviors and mannerisms of the outlook on the world matches the ideological blueprint issued by those in power. In this case, policing and ensuring conformity of manners commensurate with the ideals of the new America looks awfully familiar and eerily similar as we see today. When religion is gone, then what replaces it is the religious fervor of politics, according to Sharif Hamid. This revolution, whether the French or the Russian or the Cultural Revolution of China, or today's cancel revolution of wokeism, the indefatigable energy and desire for reformation of manners or cultural conformity teaches us that unless some safety valve is built into it, such endeavors are doomed to fail and diminish in their revolutionary potential and promise. The second aspect of the Puritan legacy is its commitment to, quote, Reformed orthodoxy, unquote, which was, as far as the Puritans were concerned, the closest approximation of divine truth and human participation therein. As such, they were fastidiously devoted to it and ensured that all arenas of learning would reflect their overall commitment to this theological ideal, which will have inestimable benefit to all who are involved. In our context, we have liberal orthodoxy, which has been enshrined as the unquestionable orthodoxy, which will brook no opposition, and with its precision and passion, is busily churning out books in the same way that the Puritan printing press, about which David knows so very well, on both sides of the Atlantic, were pumping out books incessantly due to their conviction about and commitment to Reformed orthodoxy. The last part of the Puritan legacy that Hall highlights is the way the past is memorialized and or marginalized. How should the Puritan past be memorialized today? And that is the important question for me. As someone who cares about the Puritans as a historical object and subject, and in a context where that is becoming increasingly challenging, what aspects of the Puritans or Puritan movement should be taught and published and talked about? Is it just a long echoes of the tragic that should be forgotten ASAP today, as some of my students would say? I think David's last paragraph of the book is quite, before the acknowledgments, is quite illuminating as it is elusive. He writes, meanwhile, anti-Puritanism remains alive and well, refreshed in present-day America by a sympathy for everyone in the past who was denied full freedom and cultural autonomy, in particular Native Americans and the Africans brought to this country as slaves, but also dissidents of various kinds, especially women like Anne Hutchinson. Statues of Hutchinson and Mary Dyer adorn the grounds of the Massachusetts State House in Boston. Nowhere except in the names of streets, a single town, and an undergraduate dormitory at Harvard is John Winthrop acknowledged. Of Shepherd, the visible traces are far fewer, and as I write, the word Puritan has been eliminated from the official hymn of Harvard University. The moral must surely be that misrepresentations outweigh what we have learned from 2 or 3 generations of richly informed scholarship about the intellectual, political, ethical, and social aspects of the Puritan movement. Scholarship that, in some of its branches, has underscored the vitality of the Puritan style politics and social ethics at a moment in our national history when democracy is failing and our social ethics of community is jeopardized. These were David's last words of the book. So the Puritan Finishing School, named after John Harvard, an institution David both attended and taught for almost 40 years, changed the official alma mater song of Harvard in 2017. As David wrote that the word Puritan was eliminated in the book. The original version in the final 4th verse goes something like this. Some of you may know, but I doubt, I would assume most do not. I didn't know it until I started writing this brief comment. So the 4th verse of Harvard's alma mater goes like this: with freedom to think and with patience to bear, and for right ever bravely to live. Let not moss-covered error moor thee at his side. As the world on truth current glides by, be the heralds of light and the bearers of love. And it ends with these words, till the stock of the Puritans die. So the university authorities thought that the last line was not really apropos for 21st century education at the best finishing school in the country, arguably the world. The stock of the Puritans did not die. They were simply replaced by a university-wide song lyric context in 2017. The winning last line chosen for the honor is, till the stars in the firmament die. So we went from till the stock of the Puritans die to till the stars in the firmament die. For the stock of the Puritans to be replaced by the stars in the firmament is not a shabby replacement at all. Now, whether that is actually the case or not, we will all need to read David Hall's The Puritans once again for the answer, or at least the questions. Thank you, David, so very much for this fantastic book. Once again, I've learned immensely and appreciate you so much. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Everyone. So David, you've gotten a number of questions. There's a lot to respond to, so have at it.
Yeah, I want to begin by thanking Adrienne for her nonstop behind the efforts to both organize this, and it was postponed from one conference to put on another and postponed again, and now here we are. And thank Anthea and John for allowing ASCH to put it on now. So, and I want to thank the three of you for, I have to look sideways here, but I've written down what you've all three said, and I won't be able to touch on everything. So I wrote this book. I don't always know when I start a book. I would say I never know when I start a book what its shape is going to be. And so the question of audience is, I wanted it to be readable, and but even that is a very fungible word. So, but I did know that I wanted to pay homage. The book is an homage to a couple of generations of scholars, and I don't say this anywhere, but except in the very beginning of the book, and I invoke the string of names of people I went to graduate school with or knew shortly thereafter, people like Brooks Holofield, and I'm not going to go through all the names here. And all of us were confronting the immense shadow of Perry Miller, which it's very hard to remember that in 1959, when I went to graduate school, that was it. You read the 2 volumes and that was all you had to read. And all of us gradually peeled away and took fresh starts, and Brooks's The Covenant Sealed remains a fabulously accurate and articulate response. Bill Stover's book, which I rely on a great deal, the same. Charlie's book later on. So, and then on the English side, of course, Patrick Collinson weighed on me heavily, and then some people who are less well known, John Coolidge, 1970 book on edification. Fantastic book, very underappreciated. In fact, I stumbled on it by chance. So the book is an homage to that group of people. And I'm going to pose the question, where are their successors? And then it's an homage to the other more recent scholars. And here I would just say the interesting thing for me was that when there used to be, if you looked across the ocean at English scholarship, and leave out scholars for the moment, it was denominational historians like Jeffrey Nuttall, whom I got to know slightly, and they were the ones you read because you were interested in Congregationalism. And basically, the politics of the Revolutionary period dominated English historiography, and there was very little written, except in Anglican sources, on actually religion. Very little written. And then suddenly, with Peter Lake and Collinson and then a whole string of people that goes on now in abundance, Anthony Milton, Arnold Hunt, Alexander Walsham, I could go on, Alex Ryrie, they're writing about religion in ways that is producing a body of work equivalent in power to what the generation of Holofield and Stover wrote, addressing a somewhat different set of questions, but just as excellent and just as transformative in the long run. And we could bring in the the Americanists who worked on this period, David Como, obviously of the younger generation, but also Paul Seaver and others, Sears McGee, wonderful book that I came to late, the book on the two tables, really a rich book read in context of what I was working on. So again, I wanted to, apart from trying to not be caught out too much by, I'm not a historian of Britain, by people, and this was especially true when it came to Scotland. As I say, I did want to just say emphatically through all those endnotes, and obviously the way the text itself makes arguments, that gosh, there's a tremendous amount of creative work out there. And you could be that I was so happy to reflect back in my pages. Secondly, I want to say something about Scotland here by way of segueing into Mark's acute comments. So I literally knew that a man named John Knox existed. That was the sum total of my knowledge of Scottish religious history, literally the sum total. And by the way, if you look in the Harvard Library for who has checked out books on the history of religion in Scotland, none of them have been checked out. Bought, but not checked out. I had the pleasure of being the first person to read monograph after monograph, collection of essays after essays. And then only in the very depths of Widener were the great publications of the what's the society that Walter Scott founded? Sorry, I'm blanking here for a moment.
Woodrow Society.
Yeah, there they were, in disheveled state, just terrible. Nobody looked at them. Only when I got to the Huntington were they all there beautifully in order. So, but I wanted to say that if I had any doubts about a theological approach, anything in my mind said, wait a minute, Hall, this is a path you're going to stumble. Turning to the Scottish materials proved me right. The Book of Discipline, the first Book of Discipline, the second Book of Discipline, the great orders that Knox and others create, the Order of Excommunication, the Scottish Confession, of course, to begin with, of 1560, the Great Covenants, the series of Great Covenants, the records of the Assembly, the General Assembly. Then it's harder to get hold of sermons because the fewer of them were printed. But reading, and then the great Scottish historians, even though Margo warned me David Calderwood was not completely to be trusted, which I understood, and I hope I didn't overdo David Calderwood. This is fantastic material, fantastic material. Nobody knows this material. And then when I stumbled on the diary of Archibald Johnson of Warriston, I've said this somewhere else, I was like Columbus discovering the New World. Nobody in Scottish historiography had alerted me that the best single religious diary for the first half of the 17th century, even better than Nehemiah Wallington, is Archibald Johnson's diary. He's been written off as a quack or a kook in the Scottish historiography. But here he is, this marvelous, brilliant man. So here it was, this rich theological tradition embedded in institutions, the Kirk sessions. And by the way, Margo's, I don't know how you did that fantastic edition of the Perth Records. On and on it goes. So deeply political, but of course, James VI and first recognized that political issues were involved. Religious issues were involved. On the one hand, he participated in some of those, and then he, of course, turned against the people that he was sort of allied with briefly for a little while. So deciding to make theology the center of it was not an arbitrary decision that kind of came to me out of the blue. It was also my own quest to finally come to terms with some of the contradictions of the theology. Your head is, you read this stuff, is floating around, pieces float around. I had used that Perkins chart forever and a day, but without really connecting it to the book it's attached to, a golden chain. So I went back to the golden chain, the book, and I use that term a lot in the book itself, in the book I wrote. So it just gradually came over me. And then when I read Bucer's De Regno Christi in English translation, not until the 20th century was there a full English translation, it dawned on me that in 1550, he laid out a Reformation of manners. It's all there. Every single part of Reformation of manners is there in Bucer, 1550. And even divorce is there. Possibility of divorce because marriage has become civil. And Milton then reprints that section of the book when he wants to justify divorce in the 1640s. And so while I was doing this, I suddenly felt a sense of absence, not absence in me, but absence in the literature. So I very much admire the social historians who've written about Reformation of manners in England, Patrick Collinson, John Craig, on and on. But in David Underdown's wonderful book, Fire from Heaven, he cannot put his finger on a theological idea that drove that program. He says predestination in one, just as a throwaway. That has to say something. And if he had only turned to Martin Bucer, or maybe the humanists that Margo has written about, how much richer a book, that's a beautiful book, but how much richer a book it would have been as an explanatory context for what the Godly Party in Dorchester were doing. So, so it's a double-headed thing. One is the Scottish materials were so exciting and also very political, but then also my own wish to finally come to terms with, make a sensible description, write a sensible description of the practical divinity that paid attention to Calvinism and Bucer and Bullinger and Beza and you name it. Bring them all in and then make sure that there are some interestingly contrarian voices like Culverwell and Preston and so forth and so on. So it was my own curiosity, my own sense of dissatisfaction with my own teaching, where I was really as someone who had not kept up with some of the theological work in my own work. The live religion work has not been theological in a formal sense. Forming people is not truly theological either. So audience, I was very lucky to work with a press that never asked me that question. Princeton Press lost track of the manuscript. And when they woke up to the fact that this manuscript was sitting around, they were so embarrassed that they published it. No changes asked for. So actually nobody had read the book. So that was a stroke of luck. I mean, at first it looked like a disaster and then a stroke of luck. So I want to underscore something that Mark has said here. So we tend to look for an essentialist definition of the Puritan. This is what the Puritan is. And so I'm not the first to emphasize paradox. Actually, that word is foregrounded in Michael McGiffert's work on Shepherd. So that there's a really remarkable doubling of categories in Puritan language. You're predestined, but your own activity plays a part in it. The gospel promise is preached to you, you have to respond. You should respond. And then, of course, they get around this by saying only those who are elect can respond. But the fact is they use the fact that you do respond or not. Or you're known by your works, but you're not known by your works, but you are known by your works. And I don't regard this as sloppy theology. I regard this as fully biblical. It's responding to the contradictions in Scripture itself and the inevitable contradictions in trying to explain God's ways of working to humankind. If you give humankind a role, which the Puritans are going to do, they're not automata, then you're going to run into some very interesting interpretive questions, which they thought they had pretty successfully resolved. And the Westminster Confession, I'm proud of my quickie on the Westminster Confession, which begins, of course, with a rousingly anti-Arminian assertion of divine sovereignty, and then quickly turns into, but God works through the means, and so there's all kinds of stuff we have to do nonetheless. It's a very different document than you ordinarily sort of think here it's being. So so Mark's long review in Reviews to American History and what he's here said today really captures, I think, the essential texture of the book, and also why any attempt to and Mark has also put his finger on the way that old stereotypes collapse. Now, the one that we inherited in the 1960s was the revolutionary Puritan. The Puritan is revolutionary. And every now and then that pops up again. But man, most of them are not revolutionaries. My wife is telling me don't put my hand on my chin. Or the Puritans as birthers of the modern. You can say that about a lot of things, but it's a stretch to turn the Puritans immediately into, and the Weber thesis is just Swiss cheese at best. So the complexity that I try to portray is meant to get rid of any essentialist notion of the Puritans other than the broad background of the Reformed tradition, which itself, of course, as we all know, has different branches. It's a cousinage of different tendencies, so forth and so on. And then finally, there's the question of American exceptionalism, and which is what Paul was alluding to in a way that here's the birth of America, or a founding moment of America, and that was, of course, a 19th century argument among Americans. And so mine is not a flamboyantly anti-exceptionalist book. It doesn't start out, it has a little bit of that at the beginning, but it's implicitly and explicitly an anti-exceptionalist book. As Mark, as you were saying, it folds New England into a wider context. And the dilemmas that we see in New England are the same dilemmas that beset the English movement for decades. Authority of church and state, the grace versus works, church of the few, church of the many, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, there are distinctive things because there's no Church of England around, so they have they're gradually, they adapt to a different kind of a culture. They create a different kind of a culture, different flavor, but it's not exceptionalist in any way. And I think that, so let me turn, Margo, I want to say something about your three students here. So at the moment, I'm writing a paper on the figure of the hypocrite, which has a lot of biblical sanction and was turned against the Puritan. But I'm writing about it because it's a key word in the antinomian controversy, because John Cotton and Ann Hutchinson and John Wheelwright said that anybody who assumed that assurance of salvation was based on sanctification was by definition a hypocrite. So it's been a very rich little avenue, a niche to revisit the antinomian controversy. On the other hand, the minister said, well, John Cotton, the witness of the Spirit, anybody can fake that. So, so take that. So what's so striking, we don't use the word hypocrite today so much, but what's so striking is how these negative words have become embedded in our popular consciousness. Anti-Puritanism of the classic kind somehow keeps returning, and not much else returns, but returns joyless, depressing, repressed. And it's just giving me a word here. None of which they're not borne out by the I mean, anxious, yes. Nehemiah Wellington was an anxious guy. There's no two ways about it. But plenty of others weren't. So I'm trying to turn this epithet back into the 17th century to an interestingly historical context about how the word hypocrite was not only used in anti-Puritanism, but primarily used among Puritans themselves. It won't diffuse the word, but it's one way of thinking about it. Then I want to just say about your third student, Hope. So if you go to Amazon, you click on my book, which I have done a few times, all of a sudden there pops up probably 20 books written by non-credited historians or journalists on Plymouth, Puritans, amazing books that are asserting, we're a providential nation, God is behind us every step of the way, except when we don't do the right thing. And most of these are not liberal books. They're more, sort of at the more, whatever you want to call it, conservative end of the spectrum. But in terms of audience, these books seem to sell. I mean, I don't own them. Harvard Library doesn't own some of them, but there they are out there. So there's again a deep paradox going back to the words of mine that were quoted. This rich repertoire of scholarship has left untouched a vein of popular history, or popular writing about the Pilgrims, the Puritans, about American destiny. And it just rolls on. And obviously right now, it has, or in the last 20 years, it has an extra urgency, I think, because of the the shifts in the power of Christianity and the culture as a whole, to try to reaffirm this, reuse again the Puritan past to do this. I don't think it works, but who am I to say? It's so let me stop here. Paul, I really haven't addressed what you said. I'm going to conclude in a different way. I do want to say something to Margo here. So I started reading the Scottish Historical Review when I got to the Huntington, and the early issues of the 90s were about, there's going to be this new British history, or late 80s, the new British history. Thank God Scotland's going to be incorporated. By the mid 90s, there was this dawning sense that no, we're not being included. And that brings home a point of who reads whom, who reads what. And I felt in my book how precarious it is, this crossing what seemed like easy boundaries to cross: Scottish, English, Northern Ireland, Scottish, English. No, not so easy to cross. Almost separate historiographies. And then in early America, early New England, we have people in early American literature who are all confused about the category of Puritan at the moment, very confused. And then among, as Paul, you're indicating, the Puritans have been pretty much decentered from the story of early New England, early America, for perhaps for good reason. So I worry about what's next. When who are we training who will carry on some of this rich structural history, rich theological history that Paul and Charlie and Mark and Margo all have contributed to. And I see, when I was at the Huntington, all the young British historians there, or in their 40s, knew they were never going to be replaced at their universities or colleges. That was their working assumption. We won't be replaced. And, you know, you all know there's no Reformationist now at Harvard. Nobody teaching the Reformation at Harvard. And no signs that he's ever going to be replaced. So we're in a very curious time. And I'm glad I wrote an institutional book, a theology-centered book. I wanted to show that this works. This is a viable approach to take. And going back to the woman thing, what you say about the Kirk sessions is exactly replicated in a different context in Cornelia Dayton's book, Woman Before the Bar, where women and men in 17th century Connecticut were treated exactly the same. It's not until the 18th century that you get a difference emerging. It's quite striking. And it flies in the face of all kinds of off-the-cuff assertions about it. Cornelia Dayton, Woman Before the Bar, based on nothing but court records. It's a court records study.
Let me jump in here and just remind people that if you have a question, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we're coming toward the end of the time that we had originally allotted, but Mark just texted, can we go for a few more minutes, 10 minutes more or something like that? Is that okay with the panel? I mean, people will drop off as they need to in the general audience, but if we can go for a little bit longer, this is so rich and so wonderful. David, I have a question, and there's this theme that runs through your book, and it has a biblical name that is lament. And in the at the end of A Reforming People, the last page becomes pure Jeremiad. But that last page, which Paul's already alluded to, is pure lament. And this, the topic that you're on, that you've been on for the last few minutes, and just let me quote again a phrase from that really, to me, heartbreaking last long sentence. The moral must surely be that misrepresentations outweigh what we have learned from 2 or 3 generations of richly informed scholarship. And your question of who's going to carry on, what do you say to, and maybe this goes to back to Margo's 3 students, or to Paul's students that he referred to. What do you say to a young scholar today who, for whatever mysterious reason, is captivated by the 17th century the way we have been? What do you say to them?
Charlie, can I just say something? So there is a Q&A that actually raises that very question from Israel Ben-Porat.
Okay.
Says, thanks so much for the stimulating event. As a graduate student currently working on the history of Puritanism, I'm wondering what the panelists think about the state of the field. Where do you see the scholarship headed, and what do you consider the most promising avenues of future inquiry? I think this is worth taking up, the rest of our time. I mean, starting with David and Margo and Mark and Charlie and maybe me. I mean, just really kind of weighing on a little bit about where is this field headed? Because I know I just learned Margo retires, Professor Emerita. I did not realize that. So, but I mean, as you have trained your graduate students all, I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, would you encourage students to take on Puritanism as an area of discourse for graduate studies?
I'm going to let
the fact that, as David says, it doesn't make any difference.
I'm going to let the active faculty.
No,
let's not discourage this young man.
Yeah.
I'm going to let the active faculty speak, and then I'll say something.
Okay, so as an active faculty, I would say it's not a dead field. I mean, like I said in my comments, they still matter. Puritanism still matters because it's the anti-Puritanism that is really kind of rampant, right? So it really creates a very interesting kind of discursive milieu where you can do this but then I guess what I am struggling with, especially as I'm teaching at a divinity school, is because there's such a great emphasis on presentism, you have to justify your intellectual raison d'etre by saying, but this connects and this matters today. And here's why. So I think if I'm a just straight up history department, maybe I don't have to worry about that as much. But in a religious studies or in divinity school world, your antiquated figures are only as good as the kind of contributory marks that they can make today. So, but I do think that there's what I'm learning, I mean, again, I'm not just singling out, race, gender, and sexuality, but those have been really important ways of looking at the past, including my first PhD student worked on construction of race in early modern England. And I thought that was actually fine work. I mean, Peter Lake and I were on the committee together and we both really liked it. And so it's not something that I thought much about, nor was Peter, and I don't think you have that much either, David. But I do think that the period itself is not the problem, and I do think that there are a lot of protean potential for turning it to real good use. So I wouldn't be just down on it. I mean, I think the future is not totally bright, but it's not totally bleak either. I mean, as far as humanities go.
I would agree with you, Paul. My sense is to take the questions that are being raised. I use the phrase vast early America, or questions. There has been a lot of literature written lately about Puritans, but in their relations with Native Americans and early missions and possibilities of Native American servitude and things like this. Take those questions head on, and the job for someone who's interested in the intellectual contours, the religious contours, is to let those to bring those in and have a conversation about those very issues. They can be, I think, very, very. What's the word my graduate students use? Generative. They can be very generative. In many ways. So I don't think I think it's foolish to think that a historical whole field, century, or geography will disappear. I think it's taking those new questions and working with them very strongly. Yeah.
I have a student right now working on Nehemiah Wallington's stuff with Foucault and melancholy and current situations of mental well-being in 21st century. So I think there are ways. So it's not going to be straight up history department kind of project, but nonetheless, I think it's really because he's leading with Bunyan and Wallington and the sort of Puritan navel gazing as a way to think about what it might mean for us today in 21st century, where students' mental health is such a big deal. And so it's raising the sort of shadowy side, perhaps, of Puritanism, but I think nonetheless it does get kind of a pretty decent bit of focus. I mean, he's writing on Owen's Christology of Delight and Bunyan's Christology of Despair as a way to think about despair in the Puritan tradition, and along with the practical divinity.
3 of my last 4 PhD students have done projects that are essentially religious history, but within the rubric of urban history. Right. Towns in Scotland, towns in Northern England. It's impossible to look at the history of a city and not embed the history of religion in that city as well in the 16th and 17th century. So they've done a lot of that. It's made their religious history a lot better, I think. Part of the reason I'm doing Perth is it's a very forward-looking Protestant town in Scotland, strong supporters of the Lords of the Congregation at the very beginning of the Reformation. But there's a lot more going on in that town. And increasingly, I'm finding that you can't really understand what's going on in religious history of the town without knowing something about the infrastructure of the town, the finances of the town, never mind politics, right? Doing a much more integrative study of religion, I think, may be the way of the future. If we can look at how 16th century urbanites spent their lives, what they spent most of their time doing, it sheds some light on what they heard when they listened to sermons. Not necessarily what the preacher is preaching, but what they were hearing. So I think there's some hope for the future. I do worry about the early modern period. If you're not doing the 19th and 20th century, the job market is really abysmal. And there's just no denying that.
Are there more questions?
No, we just actually had a comment from someone else, but if anybody else has a question you want to put into the Q&A, please do so. I'm going to take the liberty, David, to ask you something. thinking about this book. And I'm going to make it a contemporary issue, but it really isn't contemporary in a way. I think a lot about the phrase and how it gets used politically, city on a hill. I've had to think about it so much. And I would just like David to start, but any of you who want to say, how can we try to link this up for people so that they understand that this is not a political phrase, but a phrase that came in a very different way at the beginning? Because what I find myself doing is when I'm talking about this in class, really having to just back up and explain this. And it gets to the point that you're about to make, Margo, about nobody teaching this anymore and there are no jobs out here. You have to have a certain kind of training. As somebody who was trained in 2,000 years of Christian history, I can certainly talk about it. But I think about most people today who get maybe 19th and 20th century, and they can't even talk about Winthrop, right? And so I just wanted to hear from all of you, because this is such a ubiquitous phrase, every political season that gets used, about how do you think about talking about this now in terms of what you know? Because I think, we have this kind of relationship about what we think Puritans are in a popular culture sense versus who they are for real.
Of course, Frank Bremer talks about how the phrase is used in England, in English Puritanism. It's not a uniquely North American, English, New England Puritan phrase. It's common.
Yeah.
Actually, Abraham Mangan has an unpublished paper on how Catholics use the phrase.
Oh, interesting. I'd love to see that.
But what you're responding to, Margo, is the fact that Ronald Reagan made it the centerpiece of his public discourse.
Yes.
Starting in the 1970s. He was the first person to do so. And he made it, and then Perry Miller had resurrected it in 1940, but then Reagan seized on it somehow or other and turned it into this all resonating phrase. It's all shown. This is in Diane Rogers' book and also in Abe's book. So of course the temptation is to say, well, it's a phrase out of Matthew, and let's just get it back then, and it's a high places or sacred places for the Jewish people, right? Imagine the mountains that people go on top of, and so on and so forth, and then the final in Revelation. That doesn't do much. I mean, it gives the context for Winthrop, but it doesn't do much for the current students. So they think of this as, they could think of it as hope. That's an interesting word that Margo, one of your students said. So could we be a city on a hill? And Winthrop is there's always an if in the sermon. Will we be? Will we sustain this or not? And he ends with quotations from Jeremiah. So I want to go back to my book that Charlie was referring to, Reforming People. So the final chapter of that book is a paean to the town of Cambridge, Massachusetts, when Shepherd was the minister. And it faced a crucial decision. It was given a huge extra plot of land because the land it was on was crappy. And Shepherd said, I'm going to go down to Connecticut. And the general court says, we'll give you 8,000 extra acres of land to the church. It's to the church. And the time comes to divide up the land. And the church says, we're going to give it all to the town. And I thought, first of all, this has never been mentioned in any of the historiography. And then they divvy it up in the ways they have. They have rules about how to divvy it up, which are not democratic rules, but they are proportional and fair rules. I mean, everybody gets enough. So, and then I talked about rotation in office and accountability. And boy, were we lacking in accountability. And we've been lacking in accountability in this culture, in our political culture. I mean, there are extreme cases, but overall. And I talk about the law code and these things. And so there was a robust civil culture there, which overrides all the stereotypes or exists alongside of all the stereotypes. So that's one way that you can take that phrase and say, hey, let's complement this. Abraham has reminded me to publish this stuff. Compliment, not compliment, but compliment Frey City on how, with some sense of how do you live, how do you form a community that's not dominated by, X, Y, or Z, but adjusting. Anyway, it's a problematic that's, and going back to the city thing, as it has the same resonance. I wanted to be a social historian, but I also wanted to be an historian of ethics and ultimately of a church and how they all work together. It wasn't all smooth sailing by a long shot. So that's one quick answer to your question. But I'll just end here by saying, I spoke in Germany at the American Studies Association of Germany several years ago, about 10 years ago, and I gave some talk of the 20th century, because that's what the conference seemed to be about. And the first hand that went up was this: a woman said, "Isn't covenant the master word of American culture?" And I knew immediately that the first text she used in her course was.
Yeah. That's good.
That's it.
All right. Anyone else? Last comments, last questions. I'm looking in the chat. Paul, you answered that other question, so
Yep.
I'll let that stand. I just want to personally thank all of you for being here. David, Paul, Mark, Charles for sharing this, Margo, my former colleague, but still around, for being here and doing this. I think this was really rich. It was a great discussion. We need to have more of these. And I hope all of you out there really enjoyed that. If you did, let us know. I'm just sorry that we could not have been doing this in New Orleans, but it was just rich just the same to do it here online. So on behalf of the society and myself and John, I just want to thank you all for being here tonight.